Hi, good evening. I trust all of you can hear me clearly. Great. On behalf of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Sri Lanka, I would like to welcome you to today's webinar, Challenges in Hyper-Inflationary Situation, Real-Life Experience in Zimbabwe, organized by CA Sri Lanka Business School. So we have allocated a time towards the end for a Q&A session. So if you have any questions to the speakers, please type those in the Q&A section in the bottom for the convenience of the speakers and the moderator. So we have two subject experts, two speakers this evening. Mr. Emmanuel Denare, the Managing Director of Crest Chartered Accountants. He is a former technical director of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Zimbabwe and a technical enthusiast who served in several committees of the Public Accountants and Auditors Board, PAAB. And he has offered extensive training in IAS 29 and has assisted numerous entities in implementing hyperinflation accounting. And our next speaker is Mr. Brains Muchemwa. I'm sorry if I mispronounce your name. He's an economist who has worked as the chief economist for Met Bank and Genesis Bank in Zimbabwe prior to founding Oxlink Capital in 2010, a financial advisory firm. He has written extensively about the financial markets in Zimbabwe since 2004, penning over 350 articles. He previously served as a member of the Monetary Policy Committee of the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe and in 2015 he was appointed as the Presidential Commission that investigated loss of pension and insurance values due to hyperinflation. And we do have two moderators for this session as well. Mr. Shehan Edrisinghe. He's a partner at PwC Botswana. And then Mr. Laknath Jayavikrama. He's a member of the Governing Council of CA Sri Lanka. And also he's the chairman of the CA Sri Lanka Business School. So without further delay, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Jayavikrama. Sir, over to you.
Thank you, Niroshi, and very warm welcome and very good evening for you all from Sri Lanka. And as Niroshi mentioned, we have invited two eminent personnel from Zimbabwe to share their experience regarding the inflationary situation and the challenges and probably the solution they have tested and whether they have succeeded, whether those solutions were failed. And those things we need to discuss next 2 to 3 hours. But in order to set the tone, let me tell you that under the guidance of current President Sanjay Bandara, the CA Sri Lanka being the premier accounting body in this country, we have taken the responsibility of educating and equipping our members and the business community and other relevant stakeholders to the economic challenges we are facing currently. So we have been facing unprecedented economic situation last few months. If I name few, price of a 50 kilograms cement bag was 1,005 rupees in October 2021. Today it's 2,350 after 1st April 2022 price increase. And I don't have to mention the fuel price increase from 132 to 124 within 6 months. Then last week we heard that the National Medicinal Regulatory Authority, NMRA, has announced 29% increase in the pharmaceutical products prices. And on 8 March 2022, we have floated the currency from 200 rupees to US dollar, and today it is trading officially at 330, probably unofficial market it may have crossed 400. So in this context, we need to discuss this
Mr. Jayavikram, are you having a connection issue?
On the tsunami day, water was receding away from shoreline 100 odd meters. During that time, we didn't know that this was an early sign of tsunami. We didn't know actually that there was a tsunami concept. So some people went and tried to claim the land, newly formed land in the shoreline. So if they had known this particular fact that the water receding mean that there is a tsunami coming, so we would have definitely speeding away to high grounds instead of running into the sea. So that means we didn't know at that time what were the early signs of tsunami. So that cost probably thousands of lives in this country. So in that context, thereafter, even in high schools, school textbooks, now we are teaching what are the early warning signs of tsunami. So we have a duty to educate our next generation to equip them with necessary knowledge to face tsunami type of situation. However, that does not mean that tomorrow morning we will have a tsunami. Like that, what we are trying to do is that educate our accounting fraternity and other stakeholders about the challenges somewhere else some other people have already faced. That doesn't mean that we are already in a hyperinflationary situation. That doesn't mean that tomorrow morning we would be classified as a hyperinflationary economy. No. But we have a duty and we are trying to educate our community. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We have to get the knowledge from our colleagues in other part of the world. So without getting into further details, let me invite Brains Muchemba, senior economist from Zimbabwe. Niroshi has given read out the profile of Muchemba. He's a very senior economist. If you Google it, there may be hundreds of articles, and he has been eminent speaker in various forums. So let me invite Mr. Brains Muchemba to this webinar. Mr. Muchemba, over to you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to be invited to this important discussion where we are going to be sharing our experiences with on hyperinflation. It's quite an interesting topic. I hope it's something that you are definitely going to enjoy. We've lived through many phases of inflation, high inflation, hyperinflation, maybe hyperinflation, and go back again to inflation and so on. So I'll start with my presentation. Right, so what causes hyperinflation? This is a very interesting discussion, I should say. Can anyone hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, and the
excellent.
presentation is clear as well.
Thank you very much. There's the risk that you can spend 1 hour talking to yourself and then you discover after 1 hour that you have been speaking to yourself. Thank you very much for the confirmation. Right, so we have had hyperinflation in Zimbabwe. We have had high inflation in Zimbabwe, and we've been reading with enthusiasm what is happening in Sri Lanka, and we hope that you will be able to draw a few lessons from what transpired in Zimbabwe. So what causes hyperinflation? I'll go straight to my presentation. In economics, they will tell you that inflation is a monetary phenomenon, and that inflation is when too much money chases too few goods. My thinking from experience is that hyperinflation is caused by people more than anything else. In fact, you find that in all instances where they've encountered hyperinflation, you find that it follows a series of carefully coordinated and well-correlated bad decisions, in particular by policymakers, of course, in implementing some policy issues, with disastrous consequences. I think that is what causes hyperinflation. What are these actions now that would constitute this process, this thinking process that would cause hyperinflation? At the center of it, more than anything else, is fiscal imprudence, where you are looking at issues to do with high budget deficits. The high budget deficits are the major causes of high inflation. And of course, it spills into hyperinflation. And of course, you look as well, when you look at the present context in Zimbabwe in particular, and probably if you look as well in what's happening in Sri Lanka, you look at the issue of debt. If you contract a lot of debt and do it so imprudently, it definitely creates a lot of problems on the exchange rate, and by such affects the value of the local currency. And in trying to defend the local currency, 3/4 of the time, populist policies kick in, where subsidies start to come in, especially on fuel and food, because you see that's what policymakers usually want to focus on, the issues that affect the ordinary man in the streets. Of course, that's why policymakers are there in the first place. Of course, you start seeing the manipulation of the exchange rate. And when you look at all these combined together, fiscal imprudence, the challenges that come with high debt, high gearing levels at the national level, and of course the pursuance of populist policies to try and appease a restive citizenry, you end up having hyperinflation. So I will share the hyperinflation journey that we had in Zimbabwe. It didn't just start overnight. It started as far back as 2000 when we had the land reform, where the government of Zimbabwe decided to repossess land that was largely in the hands of the white community and redistribute it to the black population, in line, of course, with the national aspirations and so on. And what it did, it triggered a lot of international condemnation. There was capital flight. The exchange rate started losing ground. We had a lot of, in fact, the upheaval was quite significant because at the same time as well, the government started printing money to try and finance the land reform, because it was not a small exercise, it was a massive exercise. And what followed were a series of high budget deficits that eventually resulted in high inflation. And by 2003, inflation had reached almost 600%. At that time, of course, speculation was quite rife. I know my colleague Emmanuel focused now on the issues that were happening, the day-to-day issues with regards or on how people were coping with hyperinflation. I'm just looking at the economic aspects. Because of the high inflation that we started experiencing in 2003, we had a lot of policy interventions in trying to curtail inflation. Among them, we had a new governor that came into office in 2003, late 2003, I think that was November. He instituted a tight monetary policy, very tight indeed, to the extent that the stock market crashed, because at that time, the safe haven were now the real assets, because the monetary assets were losing value. The money was losing value, and therefore the banking sector in particular, because they had money, and because, as you would know, when you're in an inflationary environment, the hardest hit are those that have cash as their working capital. So the banking sector, the pension sector, and the insurance sector were the hardest hit because they hold cash as working capital, or they hold cash as well as part of their core capital. So they started investing significantly into real assets, speculating, getting into the property market, getting into the Zimbabwe Stock Exchange to try and hedge value because of what was happening on the local currency front. And so when the governor introduced a tight monetary policy at that time, most of these markets crashed. In fact, there was a huge correction to the extent that indeed the inflation came down to as low as 132% by December 2004. So the low inflation that we witnessed in 2004 was largely on account of the actions that were implemented late 2003. Now, based on the success that had been achieved in 2004 on account of the actions of 2003, the policymakers, I think, unfortunately, they thought that they'd found a solution to inflation, and they started relaxing now in terms, from a monetary policy perspective. The central bank started introducing funny schemes in the market. In particular, at first we had an auction system, where a foreign currency auction system, where participants would go to the central bank and get allocated foreign currency at a fixed exchange rate. Of course, at the time they would say it was a market exchange rate, but everyone would know that the moment the central bank starts allocating foreign currency, it will definitely be fixed. We had support prices because this country is Zimbabwe is an agro-based economy, so we have a lot of activity in the agricultural sector. So because of inflation, the government started subsidizing tobacco farmers. The tobacco farmers' output is usually sold in US dollars, but unfortunately, they were now getting our local currency, which was losing value. So the government started printing money to subsidize the tobacco as well as the buying of gold. So all that created swells of money supply in the economy, to the extent that by 2005, we had reached inflation of around 585, almost 600%. So you can imagine where we came from 132% all the way to 500, almost 600%, because of all these interventions that injected a lot of money, unproductive money in the economy. By 2006, inflation was so bad, it had come to 1,281, and because of challenges in terms of calculations and accounting and convenience, we had to chop 3 zeros from the currency. So we slashed 3 zeros in 2006 in order to at least bring some sanity in terms of the transacting to the transacting public. Unfortunately, the 3 zeros that we cut in 2006 did not go away. In fact, they came back much faster. The reason why inflation peaked significantly between 2006 and 2007 is that the central bank started engaging in quasi-fiscal activities, whereby because they have capacity to print money, they started intervening in almost every other sector of the economy, hoping that by giving free money and printing money, they would be able to at least lift the economy out of the doldrum. And unfortunately, and of course it doesn't make sense, it has never made sense anyway, and that created serious challenges now, because there were huge swells of money supply. I'll show the slides later on, where the domestic money supply was increasing at an astronomical rate, to the extent that by 2008, we had reached inflation unofficially was around 1 billion percent. In fact, the central government stopped publishing inflation sometime in August, thereabout, when it was around 231 million percent, because at that time it didn't make sense anymore. I think Emmanuel will talk about it, because prices at the time, they were now changing probably on an hourly basis, or look, in local currency, it was almost impossible to sell anything because you wouldn't know the exact value. Because I'll give an example, a very interesting example, where you know, because we're a third world country, most of our people rely on public transport. So if someone was boarding a bus going some 200, 300, 400 kilometers away, it was not prudent for the bus operator to accept our local currency, because by the time they would get to the destination 3 hours later, a lot of things would have happened. The money would have lost value. So we ended up having a situation where for you to board a bus, you probably need to, you need something physical, like a goat, like chicken, or like, so those are the real stories of hyperinflation, where money loses value on a hourly, if not minute basis. So by the time they stopped reporting inflation 230 something million%, you can imagine even the calculation. So we had to slash 10 zeros at the point from our currency, having slashed in 2009, 3 zeros in 2006. By February 2009, those zeros had come back again. So we're now having a situation where we had to slash some more zeros, and we had to slash 12 zeros. That was in 2009. So that is the hyperinflationary journey that we had as a country. At that time, the local currency was no longer acceptable by anyone, and the government had no choice but to dollarize, notwithstanding instances of price controls and many other shenanigans that happened. I know my colleague will talk about that, where executives had to be arrested, had to sleep in cells. Look, it was now better to close the business than to open the business, because once you open the business and you accept the local currency, you would not have enough time to restock or to put it back into production and recover your value. So we had gotten to that time. And in 2009, we dollarized unofficially without any formal agreement or arrangement with the United States of America, who are the issuers of the US dollar. And that period, it was a period of stability, because of course the US dollar is stable and the government had no capacity to print money. And we started encountering a deflation all the way for 2014 to 2016. Prices were coming off, the consumer prices were coming off because of increased competition and an economy that was improving. Unfortunately, the clearing system is such that banks clear through the central bank in Zimbabwe. So because we're using US dollars, the central bank didn't have US dollars, and the government had to rely on collected taxes or tax collections to spend, because these were US dollars which they could not print. But now that's where the challenge now began, where because the banks had to clear through the central bank, there had to be some electronic clearing a platform, and unfortunately we got to a point where the banks were asked by the central government to deposit all their or rather to channel all their Nostro deposits into the Nostro account of the central bank. I think that's where the challenge began, and by such doing, the central bank and the government misappropriated the US dollars that had taken from the banks, or which the banks had deposited with them, to such an extent that we started having a liquidity crunch or a shortage of US dollars. Why? Because the banks would have deposited their deposits, their Nostro deposits, with the central bank. At the time that they go to the central bank to try and withdraw those deposits to meet their daily transactions, the central bank would not have capacity now to meet its obligation, because it would have used the money for other government projects. So the challenge here was that the policymakers never grew out of the desire to spend what they didn't have. So that created a liquidity crunch. In fact, we started having a local currency in the name of a US dollar that never existed. It's a bit complicated to explain to you guys. You understand it one day, hopefully not. So we started having a liquidity crunch. So this crunch, to a layman, it was a crunch of US dollars because people had deposited US dollars in the system and they would go to the bank and they would be told there's no money. But in fact, the crunch was a result of money that had been misappropriated, not necessarily by the banks, but by the policymakers, to the extent that it got so worse that by 2019, we had to reintroduce the local currency again because the US dollars had since fled the system. No one had confidence anymore in depositing the US dollars in the system because you knew that once you deposit your money in the banking sector, you would not be able to get it. Rather, you would get electronic US dollars, which would be transferred to your account, which you would not be able now to use to make foreign to make foreign payments. So that's how we de-dollarized. So we had to come up with a statutory instrument in 2019 and reintroduce the local currency. And because of that now, because of the fact that we were now printing these local US dollars, we would call them RTGS, or real time gross settlements, you know, a term that was coined for that electronic money. We started pumping, the government started pumping a lot of that money into the market. And as you would know, as history would tell, inflation started peaking, and by 2020, we're now at, we peaked to 835, 37% in July. So you can see the journey that we took as an economy. And at that point, I think the government then realized that it could not keep forcing people to use the local currency because it had actually outlawed the use of the US dollar as it were. So as we speak right now, this economy is propelling itself towards re-dollarization again, to the extent that most of the transactions that are happening in this economy are now US dollar based as compared to the local economy. I'll proceed to look at just the inflation figures. As you can see there, our inflation peaked 231 million in 2008. That was around July, August, before, of course, we discontinued the calculation of inflation because it didn't make sense anymore. Largely as well because the Central Statistical Office that is supposed to collect inflation data had no more capacity, could not get the fuel, could not even get the people because the motivation was so low. So no one had capacity to collect data. So we just discontinued the collation of inflation numbers. After dollarization, as I was saying earlier, you see that this economy stabilized between 2010 and 2017 when we were using the real US dollars. But when the government started coming up with a creative way of printing our own US dollars on the system and utilizing the real US dollars, it indeed triggered a huge supply of money, of domestic money, which started fueling inflation. And you can see our inflation started creeping up to 2019. It was 521%, 2020 and 2021. Why in 2021 you find that the inflation started coming off is because we had a new Minister of Finance who started to do things slightly different. He adopted an austerity program around 2019, thereabout, to try and reduce or rather consolidate the fiscal expenditures and stop printing money, in fact. And that has achieved some bit of stability, what we are seeing today, but still the inflationary pressures remain. So now let's look at the issues that really triggered this from an economic perspective. So if you look at our experience, we had a death in multilateral support on the exchange rate just after the land reform program. And we were kicked out by from the Commonwealth, as well. They had, IMF suspended the fund, suspended assistance to Zimbabwe. And what it meant is that we had to live or to do with a free falling exchange rate. What happened thereafter is that we started implementing a lot of exchange control regulations, including but not limited to restricting capital outflows, determining what can be imported and what cannot be imported, having a fixed exchange rate. But of course, all those things, of course, could not work because we were printing a lot of money. And I think what is key for Sri Lanka to note is that there's some interesting signposts here for the Sri Lankan policymakers to look at, or rather to note from my experience. When you look at the debt levels in Sri Lanka, we are seeing that in fact you sort of have a debt crisis. Your maturing obligations, you seem not to have capacity to meet the obligations in US dollar terms, of course, and your reserves are now stretched to the limit. I think you are just around 1 month import cover. And when you look at your maturities between 2022 and 2026, they're quite huge, about 26 billion. And this COVID issue is not going anywhere. Your tourism sector may not be able to recover as fast as you want. I read you had to cut VAT significantly. In fact, it's one of the biggest cuts that I've read in history. So when you look at all that combined, definitely you seem to be in a serious debt crisis. Of course, the policymakers will tell us that they've got a plan to arrest the situation and create an environment that will be able to generate sufficient cash flows to amortize the debt. But then the challenge is that because of this crisis, the debt crisis that you have in Sri Lanka, the market starts to form expectations. And when people start to form expectations and opinions, they start to disbelieve to some extent what the central or the policymakers will be saying. And in such a scenario, you'll find as well that the policymakers, because the people will be having disbelief and will be acting otherwise, the exchange rate will be going north, the policymakers will have a temptation to fix the exchange rate. So once you start fixing the exchange rate, those are exactly the issues that we started having in Zimbabwe. You then curtail the inflow of foreign currency, and when you curtail the inflow of foreign currency, you still need to import. You still need to import your fuel. You still need to import your food. You see, so you still need the foreign currency, and you still need as well to service the debt that is maturing. So when faced with that scenario, the temptation is quite huge from a policymaking perspective to try and hold to fix the exchange rate. And when you do that, it creates now other problems, which I'll talk about in future. So is later in my slide. So I think what is important now for Sri Lanka to note from our experience is that we tried many times to fix the exchange rate. It never worked. We tried many times to arrest people for trading on the parallel market, on the alternative market rather. It didn't work, and it didn't improve the flow of foreign currency into the economy. And the other challenge with trying to fix the exchange rate, as you will see from my next slide, is that the central government and the people in general, those that pay tax, will end up having to subsidize the whole economy. So from a Zimbabwe perspective, if you look at the source of our inflation, in particular the high budget deficits, our high budget deficit started around 2004, like I said earlier in my slides, when the government thought they'd won the battle on inflation and they started printing money, coming up with some funny facilities and concessionary lending schemes to try and boost the economy. All these things were being done not from the recurrent from the recurrent expenditure from the government rather, but it was being done by the central bank. So the central bank started what would be known as quasi-fiscal activities, where they start financing programs on behalf of the government. And when you look at that graph that is there, you see that the central bank started printing money, and you can see there that the major challenge that came from the high budget deficits is that the central bank started printing money, and you can see there that unrealized exchange rate losses were quite significant. You look at interest cost on open market operations, look, they were quite huge, and to the extent that by 2007, that is when our inflation was peaking significantly, the quasi-fiscal activities of the central bank were now over 100% of GDP. What it meant is that the central bank was printing a lot of money. In this country in particular, the central bank was now subsidizing fuel, it was subsidizing food. That is, we import wheat, we import sunflower, and so on. So when you fix an exchange rate, someone is paying for the real cost of the money. So that is exactly what was happening. We as well had to pay a lot of money for that money that you print. So when a central bank starts printing money, it prints money to pay for economic activities that are happening in the economy. But because you want to sterilize that money as well to try and manage inflation, you have to buy it back, what you would probably call open market operations. And by such, you are actually buying back your own money that you'd have printed. And that's a huge cost that has got a huge impact on inflation, because it's a double whammy where you print money in the first place, and then you have to increase again money supply by paying an interest to take it out of the market. So open market operations interests, look, costs had to rise above 40% of GDP. So that on its own was the major driver of inflation in Zimbabwe. And when we had hyperinflation, it can surely and squarely be placed at the door of the central bank that are engaged in non-core activities. And when it starts small. I see from Sri Lanka, of course, you have got a lot to learn from Zimbabwe. If you look at that, you will see that it's not prudent at all to subsidize the exchange rate, because what you do is that you are printing money to subsidize the exchange rate. Is not prudent equally to subsidize any food whatsoever, because you are paying below cost. And how do you pay below cost? Someone has to pick the bill, and who does that is the central government. And how do they do that when they don't have a surplus on the balance on their primary budget? They print money. When you look at I'm just looking at the signposts or similar issues that are happening in Sri Lanka. When you look at the central bank net credit to the government, it rose from about 400 billion in November 2019 to about 2 trillion in November. That's a huge increase. If you look at the graph, if I put the graph there, you see that it's quite steep. So you can see there that the central bank, to some extent, is now engaging as well in quasi-fiscal activities, which activities will eventually, look, this is an injection of money into the economy. If this government or if the central bank decides to sterilize it, to have to pay interest again to take it out of the market. And so you now have a situation where you print your own money, you put it in the market, and then you have to take it out again and pay an interest, you see, which is a double whammy. Even when you look at what's happening on the commercial bank assets, you see that it's all the banks. When you look at, I was just looking at the bank balances from the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. I was seeing that their holding of government assets rose to around 3 trillion rupees in November 2019. From, I think that should be that should be November 20 to November 2021, sorry, not 2019, from around 1.9 trillion in June 2019. Take note of that. There's a mistake. That should be November 2021. So what is happening there is that you find the banks start crowding out the government starts crowding out private sector. The banks start holding more of the government assets. In fact, there's a point in Zimbabwe where the banking sector was literally holding almost 90% of their assets in government assets or in government securities, because at the time the government would be just issuing a lot of debt, and the banks would be asked to subscribe. The interest, of course, will be low, but the banks have no obligation, have no alternative but look to just comply. When you look as well at your deficits, I think their deficits are going up. They're not bad. It's not bad, really. You can't compare this to Zimbabwe, even what I'm talking about, your credit to the government and commercial bank holding of government assets. It's not as bad, but I think what is important is to note that if you continue in this direction, you are definitely following the same path that Zimbabwe took. Because in 2003, as you can see there, we're just around 5% of GDP. In 2004, we increased, went to 30% of GDP. In 2005, we're 80%. And what it does is that it starts creating a self-feeding a cycle where inflation starts to feed from itself. Even when you look at your deficits, you see they are quite high. It's 12% of GDP is not small, but I think it becomes important to manage these high deficits, because the only way to monetize deficits for small countries is to print money. There are usually not two ways about it. You can borrow, but once you borrow as Sri Lanka, of course, you start as well worsening the existing debt challenge that we have. We had serious challenges in Zimbabwe with regards state-owned enterprises here, where the central bank was printing a lot of money to finance fuel. Because what then was creating challenge for the politicians and the policymakers was the restive. The population was quite jittery. You see people become agitated. So the only way to pacify them is to give them something for free, or rather to give them something so cheap. So the central bank started printing money, buying foreign currency, and subsidizing fuel. You got to a point in 2007 where a liter of fuel was now far cheaper than a liter of water, because these were now subsidized commodities. And what it happens is that all those losses that would be generated by the state-owned enterprises, they eventually have to be monetized, and they are monetized by the central government. And when the central government monetizes these losses, it does so through printing money, because it has to pay. You see, you don't make a loss and there is no outflow. I think it's something that you may need to look at in Sri Lanka, in particular when you look at your big state-owned enterprises such as Ceylon, for example. The price of fuel has to remain at cost recovery. It can't be subsidized, because you surely you follow the same path that we followed in Zimbabwe, right? So that was the core in terms of the trigger of hyperinflation, the activities of the central bank, in particular delving into ordinarily government functions, where it starts extending loans there, it starts creating a facility there, it starts thinking that the price of fuel is high and it has to be subsidized, it starts thinking that the exchange rate is not at the right place, right? So we dollarized, like I said earlier, in 2009, and I'm just going to touch on the challenges that we had from a dollarization perspective. So when we dollarized, things were very good for everyone, the business sector in this country, the government, because it took a lot of the challenges away. But like I said earlier, when I was presenting on the timeline of our inflation challenges in this country, we got to a point where the government then started utilizing the private deposits for its own use, and replacing those deposits with electronic money, which was not necessarily US dollars. So what you see there in that graph is that when we started dollarizing, when we dollarized in about 2009, the nostro deposits as a percentage of the total banking deposits were around 50%, which was a bit normal. I think those that are quite familiar with banking would know that banks generally start creating credit as well. So the banks would start creating credit, charging interest and generating and creating, that's how the money is created. And unfortunately, when we dollarized, I think we never had an idea that we needed to manage the interest rates in particular, because the interest rates were quite high during that time. They were almost around 50–60% per annum, because the money was scarce. There were no US dollars, and everyone wanted to restart their business after having been hit by inflation for about 4 or 5 years. So what it did, it started creating a lot of money. The banks started creating a lot of money, and unfortunately, most of the money that the banks were creating the money was really not US dollars per se, because the lending was not largely to the exporters that would generate foreign currency. The lending was just to everyone, including households and all that. And what it did, it started creating an imbalance in the banking sector. And so the total deposits, as a percent, the nostro deposit, the real US dollars, as a percentage of the total deposits, that ratio started coming off from around 50% in late 2009 to as little as 2% in 2008. Of course, that is the time that we eventually had to bring back the local currency, because at that point in time, there were no more US dollars at all in the market. Because by 2014, thereabout, people realized that if you deposit your US dollars, you'll not be able to get it. So the inflows into the banking sector started dwindling to the extent that by 2018, thereabout, you couldn't get a US dollar, even $5 from the banking. You wouldn't get into a bank and get $5 US dollars, even if you had 1 million in there, because the bank would tell you that they didn't have the money. The only money that they could give you was the electronic balance, is the money that they could transfer, which money was, of course, had now become US dollars. So what have we learned from our 2 episodes of inflation? Remember, Zimbabwe, the episode of inflation just before dollarization, and immediately 4 years after dollarization, we started as well experiencing inflation. So that inflation caused by people is not in doubt. In fact, like I said earlier, inflation is caused by a group of policymakers that believe that whatever they're doing is correct, and they believe in things that everyone else is not believing in. That's the funny bit about inflation. And consistently, they follow the wrong things with so much resolve that look, everyone else who is not sitting with them on the same table would still be amazed at how they will be making such decisions, and that's what creates inflation. So you can see from a lessons learned perspective that as a country in Zimbabwe, we didn't learn anything at all. We had hyperinflation in 2006, 7, 8, 9, and we dollarized, and we thought that as policy, as a people, we'd learned. We started again. I'm just trying to show you here how and why they say inflation is a monetary phenomenon. Of course, being fed by a mindset of policymakers that believe that they are doing the right thing. When you look at our deposits are banking sector deposits to some extent approximate the growth in money supply. That is, if you look at M3. And when you look at what happened in Zimbabwe in particular, 2015 to 2018, just as an illustration, you see there that the banking sector deposits grew by 83%. At the same time, our economy just grew by 9.8%. So one would ask, what is the source of this growth, really, of the banking sector deposits? It's not like we got a lot of money coming in from abroad, or we had huge inflows of foreign currency or capital flows. In fact, what happened there was just what I was talking about earlier: the printing of money, high budget deficits. So these are the issues that definitely bring down a currency. And when you start bringing down a currency, there's usually panic. And when you panic, you try to put controls. When you put controls, you hope that they're going to hold. And then you start subsidizing as well, because the very people that you are trying to protect are the ones that unfortunately get hit worse by the same measures that you are putting. Because when you subsidize, for example, let's assume in Sri Lanka you subsidize fuel, you are subsidizing fuel, but surely a subsidy has a cash flow. The money has to come from somewhere else. It just can't be from heaven. And what it does is that it all goes back to the central government, because the central government is subsidizing. And when they subsidize in that way, when you know they are running already a budget deficit, they end up printing money. They get the money, of course, from the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. They would extend credit to the government, but look, that's creating money supply. And that same money that you are enjoying today in terms of a subsidy, in terms of fuel, will now unfortunately compound your problems, because it's the same money that is going to devalue the value of your currency, and the problems just keep going on and on and on until I think a time where either the policymakers wake up to the reality or you dollarize or they dollarize, right? So what has been the impact on our livelihoods? I think this is one area that my colleague is going to touch on. I was just looking at the economic aspect, but out of interest, I just thought that you might need to understand what happens when you have hyperinflation. When it comes to your pockets or your assets, you'll find here that, for example, our average earnings in Zimbabwe were $1,500 per month in 1990. They came to less than $10 in 2008. In 2008, I was a chief economist of a bank, just to give a practical example. I was chief economist of a bank at the time. My salary was less than $25. And it was so bad that the day that I got paid, I had to immediately convert my money into hard currency. If I didn't, then probably I would be able to buy $3 or $4. I always give the practical example of how I bought my first house. I bought my first house in November, one of my houses in November, in sort of October of 2007, for 30 billion Zimbabwe dollars. So that was a mortgage for 20 years, because that was a staff mortgage for 20 years. But by December of the same year, my salary was almost 200 billion. So in less than 3 months, I had paid off a house. So I titled this to a house that I had paid off just 2 months. So that was inflation or hyperinflation. We had pensioners losing value. You look at the real interest rates there, for example. So because the central bank would be trying to accommodate the private sector, interest rates would be low. So the real rates of interest, were almost negative. You put your money, you put $100 equivalent on the investment markets. By the time you take out your money, it's less than 1 cent US dollars. So what are the key lessons for Sri Lanka to learn from Zimbabwe? Number one, fiscal consolidation is key in averting high inflation. I think what is very important for the policymakers in Sri Lanka is to understand that high budget deficits are not sustainable. You cannot avert them by just giving promises. You need to come up with painful measures, which would unfortunately touch on those sensitive issues, taxation, for example. The VAT taxes that you cut in 2019 are probably the first things that you need to increase. Look, you need to reduce subsidies. People will need to be able to pay for the market price of goods and services, be it fuel, be it energy, because those are the issues that really attack the exchange rate or that affect the exchange rate, the importables. And when you then have a debt crisis on the other hand, then it compounds the problem. Central bank independence is key. This is where we lost it in this country. Our central bank is not independent, and as such, it became an extension of the central government in executing quasi-fiscal activities. I'm aware the Central Bank of Sri Lanka is not independent. There were reforms, I guess, or efforts to take it towards that route, but I think it's an issue that is very difficult in small open economies. The other lesson that you guys would need to learn from us is that you can fix an exchange rate. You can have capital controls, you can have price controls, you can have any other administrative controls to reduce inflation. But the only thing that all these things do is that they exacerbate the situation. The only way to manage inflation, to manage the exchange rate, to manage it, or to improve capital controls and to stabilize the prices is to reduce or to embark on genuine fiscal consolidation, which will be painful for the first 1 year or so, but after that, look, everything will stabilize. Populist policies, which is quite common in most low-income countries, that usually come in forms of subsidies and so on. We had those many times. Unfortunately, they hate the very people they will be attempting to protect, because in subsidizing, you're creating another swell of money supply, and that then, creates a vicious cycle. You start inflation. When inflation is high, you need to subsidize again, and as you do that until the local currency loses value. And I think one more important aspect, the last one, is to look from the lessons here, is that it's possible to lose everything in a hyperinflationary environment, from patience accumulated over the years to assets, and of course, more importantly, the dignity aspect. I know my colleague is going to look at these issues, the real life experiences that we as Zimbabweans experienced, where, for example, you would never find fuel at a fuel station. The only place to find fuel would be in a jerrycan somewhere, where, because of corruption and all this, you would not be able to fill up from a. If you would need to do that, then that would probably take you 4 or 5 days in a queue. Thank you very much. I hope I'm still not talking to myself here. It's so quiet. I wish someone would just cough so that at least I would know that there are people here.
Thank you very much, Brains. I think sometimes I may wonder whether we have copied everything from Zimbabwe. Actually, Brains, you are in Sri Lanka, because some of the examples what you had just mentioned has already happened. And the central bank policy making, to the shortages and lessons never learned, and all these things had already happened. So, and one major point I would like to take away from your note is that that in economic point of view, the subsidies given by the government by printing money actually hurt the very people they intend to protect. That means we have been enjoying fuel subsidies for a while, but on the other hand, the same people have been suffered through some different means. It is a very interesting notion to take away. Okay, with that one, let me invite Emmanuel to share his